Thank you all. We're going to roll into our first panel, which is on rural broadband. And this is going to be very discussion focused, with me playing the role of a sort of snippy nanny when anyone talks for too long. The goal is to have a very conversation style in which we all talk frequently, but in short durations per. So. This is something that we've had a lot of fun with in past years, and I want to thank Stacy with Google again for having us here. It's really great to have this space so conveniently located that people are familiar with, feel comfortable in. So I'm excited to be back here again, and I'm Chris Mitchell with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. In that role, I also serve as the policy director for Next Century Cities, and I host the Community Broadband Bits podcast, which is one of the most beloved, least listened to podcasts on the face of the earth, I think. I think I've met every person who listens to it, and I do appreciate it. A lot of conversations with folks that are doing really interesting things at the local level. But we're going to introduce our panel. Each panelist is going to tell us a little bit about where they come from, their organization comes from, and also how they define the rural broadband problem. And then we're going to launch into some things and see where we can agree and disagree civilly. So I'd like to start with Brent Skorup. He's a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks to the host for having me. It's great to be here talking about this important subject. So my name is Brice Cora. I'm at the Mercatus Center at GMU. And I do telecom, media, transportation technology, kind of jack of all trades over there. And I'm on the FCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, and also on the local Arlington County Broadband Advisory Committee with Deb. And so I've kind of seen the local side of this, the federal side, and my view is, and what I've been writing about this for a few years now about rural broadband is that the existing programs are far too complex. There's, at last count, 7 existing Highcost Fund programs, and with all different models and ways of distributing money, and so it's too complex and not effective.
Thank you for setting the right duration tone. Next, we're going to go to Shirley Bloomfield, the CEO of NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. Welcome.
All right, thank you very much, and I'll talk really fast so I can cram even more into that short time. I represent about 850 rural carriers across the country. They cover about 40% of the landmass, but 7% of the population base. So when we were talking Arctic Circle, we know that area extremely well, very remote. My companies are community-based companies. They're all of the telephone cooperatives across the country, and they are community-owned companies. So they are those who are literally folks serving their neighbors. And the one thing that I would share is I think there's honestly a rural-rural divide. People like to talk about the digital divide. I think it's a rural-rural divide, and I think the divide really kind of comes down to those large carriers that have different financial obligations and incentives and priorities, to be really frank, and those who are actually serving, the schools where their kids go to school and their parents where they are aging in place. That is where I see the big challenge that we need to figure out how to face.
Thank you. Now we have Harold Feld, Senior Vice President at Public Knowledge.
Okay, well, Public Knowledge, we're a DC-based advocacy organization. We advocate for the right of people to access information globally, including, most importantly, through broadband. We believe very strongly that the reason why we care about this as a policy matter is that broadband has become absolutely essential in all aspects of our lives and our economy, and I am glad I no longer have to debate that pretty much. I just have to debate whether I'm using the dreaded utility word or not. But defining the problem, I'm not sure exactly what we mean by that. On the one hand, I think the problem flows from a very simple equation, which is it costs more money than people expect to be able to make in order to deploy systems that have adequate speed in rural areas. Now, you can solve that in a bunch of different ways, which I'm expecting is what we will talk about here, but I think ultimately it's clear at this point that our problem isn't selling this to people and explaining why it's essential. Our problem is how do we provide it in a sustainable way?
Thank you. And we're going to have our final panelist introduce himself, John Chambers, who's a partner with Conexon, working with rural electric cooperatives to build the networks that we're going to be talking about.
Thanks, Chris. I'm the one Chris was referring to about going on too long, so can't seem to clear my throat in less than a couple of minutes. I've been involved in my career in the two great infrastructure projects of our time, the construction of the first broadband networks and the construction of the first digital wireless networks. And so for me, when I was asked to leave the FCC a few years ago, I decided to...
Asked by who?
Yeah, well, the chairman of the FCC. I decided to work on what I thought at the time, still think is the next great infrastructure project of our time, and that is the construction of networks that removes the constraints of speed and bandwidth from human and machine endeavors. And so I did what I have done at other times in my career. I found a partner and founded a company. And what we do, all we do, is we work with rural electric co-ops building fiber to the home networks in rural America, areas that the FCC considers high cost and extremely high cost. We write business plans, we raise capital, we design networks, we construct networks, oversee construction of networks, we operate networks, and we do that across the country. So just in the last few years, we have written over 80 business plans. We're working with over 30 fiber to the home projects across rural America, building over 100,000 miles, that's last mile fiber networks. To me, the problem can be thought of in the great words of Michael Gerson years ago, referring to a different problem, which is the soft bigotry of low expectations. You heard a little of it described earlier. Is satellite good enough? Is fixed wireless good enough? Is the current speeds of DSL good enough? Are things good enough for rural America that we wouldn't accept elsewhere? And so we can talk about the solutions, but that's my definition of the problem.
So that brings us right into one of the key questions that I, in moderating this panel, I came in with a bit of an agenda, which is that I continue to believe that there is a feeling that there's a demand side problem, that people, one of the challenges of building rural broadband is there's just not enough of the households in rural America that want to pay for it or can pay for it. And so I wonder if we can discuss that a little bit. Is there a problem with the number of people who desire broadband in rural areas?
I'm going to go ahead and disagree with that. I think particularly when you look at rural Americans actually have the handicap of distance. So, the luxury that we have here in Washington, D.C. is you can walk out and you've got access to all these services. Well, you're in rural America, the ability to actually access those services is a lot more difficult. And maybe it's knowledge, maybe it's medical care, maybe it's, interesting use of technology to bridge some gaps, public safety. So I think that the demand is there. I think it kind of goes back to some of the points that particularly Harold made. It's cost, it's expensive. And it's expensive to deploy, it's expensive to build and maintain these networks. And you've got a population base that frankly is actually at a lower income bracket than the rest of, certainly compared to urban America. So when people start making choices, they're having to make choices that are based financially. So I think demand is there. I do think we need to do a better job, which we work through our Smart Rural Community Initiative, to educate communities on what is it beyond email. How do you look at Wi-Fi as a way to empower your school children? How do you look at, how do you do VA telemedicine in the local library? So we do a lot of efforts to actually make communities smart rural communities.
Yeah. I think that in a world where you can't fix a tractor without a broadband connection, and where you can't fill out a government request for your tariff relief subsidy without a broadband connection, because if you're at too low speed, it'll kick you off and you have to start the forms all over again, that we're past where we were at one point, I will say, because when I started this and started doing this, 15, 20 years ago, when there was a question of why would I want this? Why do I care? I'm getting along just fine without it. I think we're very much past that. The issue for me, it seems, is you can either find ways to bring down the cost of deployment, because I think Shirley really hit the point of, and carriers want to do this, but it's expensive to provide. You have fewer customers from which to recoup your investment, and they are lower income to boot. So all of the factors are working in exactly the wrong way. So you have to figure out how to change. This is, if you learned how to do algebra in middle school, and more importantly, if you remember how you learned to do algebra in middle school, it's like you can change one of the variables to try to figure out what X is. Is it going to be, you're going to lower the cost of deployment? Are you going to somehow make the customers more valuable through subsidies paid directly to the customers, for example? Or are you going to find people who are less concerned with taking their profit directly in a standard carrier rate of return fashion and view it more as either small business level locally, where they're not worried about where certain levels of profit are fine, or they're institutions that take their payment in other ways.
Yeah, on the demand question, so NTIA polls, and NTIA is in the Department of Commerce, they survey customers every year about, for those who don't have internet access, why don't you have it? And consistently, most people say they don't have an interest in it. So it's absolutely a factor. And they also ask about cost, and about 22% say cost is the primary reason they don't have internet access. So it's absolutely a factor. I mean, and this is, in most states, most people don't have internet access, say they don't have interest. However, I don't want to put too fine a point on it. Clearly there is demand, and I think a lot of this is just knowledge about broadband networks and just not knowing what services it offers, because every year, so for the past 5 years, according to the latest FCC data, carriers are providing about 4 million new broadband connections in rural areas every year. So clearly there is demand, and that number of people who don't have internet access is shrinking, and more people are going to mobile only, actually. So they might not be power users, but I think in time you'll absolutely find that people do want this, particularly as they know about the capabilities and the services that are offered.
So my perspective is there is no demand side problem. In any marketplace, there's buyers and sellers. In the rural broadband marketplace, the large telephone companies are largely sellers. People I work with are buyers. We believe in rural broadband. We believe in constructing networks in rural areas because we believe there is demand, and it's not just belief. It's borne out in the revenues that we receive, which pay for the construction of these networks. I work with investors. We invest in rural America. And I'll give one state as an example. We have 6 projects ongoing in rural Arkansas right now. Now, I know most people from the East Coast, and I'm from the East Coast. I know the attitude of most people towards Arkansas and rural Arkansas in particular, and maybe what you know about Arkansas and Missouri comes from the TV show Ozark. Where we sell services in rural Arkansas and rural Missouri and rural Oklahoma and everywhere else, we sell 2 speeds. We sell 100 megabit per second symmetrical service and gigabit service, symmetrical service. We sell 100 meg for $49.95 and gigabit for $79.95. That's our core offering. We see no issue with demand. In fact, you could believe this or not, but most people, where we make service available in rural Arkansas and elsewhere, buy 100 megabit or gigabit service. It's about a 70-30 split. So when you make gigabit service available, just as Google found out in Kansas City, If you make that same service available in rural America, you find the same kind of demand. We find the same demand in rural America that you find in urban and suburban America, and that shouldn't surprise anybody.
That was very orderly as we went down the row, so I'm going to insist that we not be so orderly.
Oh, good. Can I jump in then?
Please.
I did want to, there were a couple things, Brent, that you raised that I wanted to point out as some of the problems of measurement and how we think about this. So, yeah, we will look at, there may be a growing number of wireless homes. We have not tried to map whether that is primarily urban, primarily rural. So I can say, yeah, there's a demand in rural for particular types of broadband that's not being met through mobile, or mobile there is not sufficiently reliable. Doesn't mean that there aren't people who are going mobile only, but they may be in urban areas where you get higher mobile speeds because of density. They have better reception. There are a wide variety of things. I think one of the problems we have to be careful of when we're talking about this is our tendency to kind of take different measures and mix them around. I think that when we focus on rural America, go and talk to people in these communities, we find that, yeah, they're very aware that they don't have broadband. There is indeed a great deal of demand for it, oftentimes for things that we tend not to even think about because it's ubiquitous here and we don't worry about it. But or as I like to say, the only people who don't think that there is a broadband problem are those people who have broadband.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing about the rural wireless. So Pew in April put out a report about internet using households, and I found this astonishing. For Americans who have internet access, 24% are mobile only, smartphone only, which is pretty astonishing. And for rural, it's 23% of internet using households are smartphone only. So, this is a good thing if you care about universal. Increasingly, consumers are viewing mobile as a substitute. For most people, it probably isn't, but for a lot of people, it is. And I think that opens up options about when it comes to solutions, and particularly for the subsidy programs that we have.
Well, I do have to say just one anecdote, and then I'll yield the floor to other folks here, which is back in 2009, I was presented by a well-known rural academic with a couple of case studies in which people had dial-up. Local telephone company had made DSL available. A number of people tried it, and then they switched back to dial-up. And she was, looking at making some conclusions about this with regard to demand. And I said, "What was the quality of the DSL that was offered?" And she said, "Well, it was pretty lousy." I was like, "Do you think maybe that had something to do with why people gave it up and went back to, at that time, a somewhat more reliable, if slower, dial-up than a much less reliable and much more expensive DSL?" Oh yeah, I probably should have asked about that. I worry a lot about some of these numbers and the way that we are getting very, very different answers to survey questions. Commissioner Rosenworcel touched on this earlier in the discrepancy between the FCC's number of who has access versus other studies that of people who say they don't get access or certainly not access at broadband speeds. And so I just want to draw a note of caution here, even on the better conducted studies, that there are a number of things that are important to probe beneath the surface.
Comment on the technology question, because of all the others, this is a subset of the problem. Of all of the other questions that Washington grappling with technology is probably the thing Washington does among the worst at. The FCC does collect data on consumer choices in the marketplace. It doesn't make that data public. And in fact, if Commissioner Rosenworcel is no longer here, if she wants to, she can ask the staff at the FCC to give her that data, and maybe she would know more than you'd get just from the 477 provider data. Part of the problem in government decision-making, and look, as a private investor, I think everybody, whether it's, Google or AT&T or Facebook or Comcast or anybody else that wants to invest in their technology, or Viasat, as was mentioned earlier, knock yourselves out. My bet is on fiber. My bet is on fiber over wireless and fiber over satellite and fiber over every other thing. But I only make money if people choose my service. That's not the way Washington doles out money. So this'll be my theme about whenever you're getting to the point of looking for answers. There has to be an element of consumer choice in federal spending programs. Without an element of consumer choice, all you're left with is this kind of back and forth of what does this survey say? And I think, fixed wireless might be cheaper. And in some parts of the country, that might be better. Or maybe satellite is a solution for, I don't know, the Arctic, for God's sake. That's not the debate, and that's not what people in rural America are asking. If you let them choose a service, or you let providers get federal funds, state funds based on consumer choice, you'll do a much better job than a regulator setting a standard, 4 megabits per second when I joined the FCC, 10 megabits per second when I left the FCC, 25 megabits per second now, maybe 100 megabits per second. You know what people choose? They choose the best level of service available for their budget. So if you put an element of consumer choice in the public funds, again, I don't care, private spending should chase whatever return you can make. But when it comes to public funding, there should be an element of public decision making.
So we're gonna come back to that, because I know in particular Shirley and I talked a little bit about that. But I want to do one thing before we deal with this question of the consumer choice and the vouchers, and that's start to talk about the Highcost Fund. And I thought it might be useful. I thought with Blair and former Commissioner McDowell speaking earlier, they may have assumed a little bit too much knowledge about the contribution factor and stuff like that. So I thought I'd try to quickly go over it and ask my experts here to correct me if I'm wrong, and then we'll talk a little bit about ways we might change it. But basically, long distance charges, effectively, you pay a tax on. That's on the order of 16, 17%. And that money goes into a high cost fund, goes into a fund that is split among many different areas. A lot of that money goes into something called the high cost fund, which serves the higher cost areas of North America, of the United States and North America, obviously. And it does it by primarily giving it to the incumbents that have operated there historically. And so this is billions of dollars per year. And the Connect America Fund is now a collection of the Universal Service funds that has changed the way it doles that money out, although most of it has still gone to the big incumbent providers. I think a lot of our discussion will talk about how we'd like to change it, but I'd like to lead into it by Shirley. That mechanism brought fiber to almost all of North Dakota, which surprises people whenever I talk about it, because people will say, well, we're never going to get fiber across the prairie. And I'll say, well, not again. We've already done it. North Dakota and South Dakota are consistently the fastest states, at least in the top 5 of all U.S. states for broadband now. And so I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that, because your members were essential in that.
So that was really loaded, and you threw a lot of stuff in there. So I would also just kind of step back just a little bit to talk. When you talk about universal service, you can get into the weeds really, really fast. But just a couple points to note. It funds the Lifeline, the low-income program, the E-rate, which is schools and libraries. It also has, as you noted, the Highcost Fund, which my companies participate in, and which has led them to make a lot of investment in fiber. But you've also got the Connect America Fund, which has been where the large price cap carriers have pulled from.
Sorry, the large price cap carriers are?
Being the Verizon, AT&T, Verizon, not so much AT&T, CenturyLink, Frontier, Windstream, some of those providers. And I think this was the first effort that we saw, and jury's still out, about whether or not there really are some obligations, some teeth to you must build where you take the money, which I think in the past, I would say, has been a little bit more of an issue. But when you step back and you look at states that are very fiber heavy, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, when people are making some of these investment decisions, wireless is tough in a rural area. I mean, everybody's all excited about 5G, and I think that's great, because you're going to need a tower up, 2 towers up a rural driveway. to bring a 5G service out there. And I start thinking about scalability. When you build these networks in rural America, it's expensive. You don't want to be going back in and incurring that expense over again. And I think we've got to be honest about the fact that American consumers are demanding more and more and more, and that capacity is just going to grow exponentially. If you go to CES, your head blows up in terms of, you know, all of the different applications that it will take. But when I pull back to a state like North Dakota, where it is the most fiberized state, you know, I think part of it is foresight. First of all, part of it, quite honestly, is years ago, Qwest sold all of their exchanges to my carriers. Qwest, to their credit at that time, looked at it and said, you know what, we're just not going to invest out here. We don't get an ROI. It doesn't make any sense. We don't want to serve North Dakota. So my guys were able to get together as a group, and I've got about 15 carriers out there, and they bought the property, and then they split it up among themselves. That created a really different sense of investment and incentive because, again, it's a community-based provider that their community lives or dies by their connectivity. The other thing that they've done, which I think is really interesting, and hopefully we'll get to as we talk about solutions, they're very collaborative. So what they've done in both North and South Dakota is they've built state fiber networks where all of the carriers in the state basically have thrown their assets into a pool and they connect via a switch. And they actually look to do things like backhaul to Verizon and AT&T. They actually, in a very collaborative, cooperative way, have figured out ways to utilize their fiber to a maximum extent and also to kind of extend the reach of their network. And that has provided the right incentives for those states to be so connected. And when you look at precision agriculture, you know, those are some of the states to be looking at for some really innovative work, you know, in days ahead.
You know, I just want to, before I let panelists take over again, I want to tag Brent because, Brent, you've looked at research in Montana, and you're deeply concerned that what you've seen is an increasing cost per line and a shrinking number of subscribers in place. So I was wondering if you can talk about your concerns about the Highcost Fund.
Yeah, thank you, Christopher. So, like I said at the outset, I think these programs are far too complex. There's at least 7 of them. The FCC keeps reforming it, it seems, every 3 years because of real and perceived problems with how the money is distributed. And I looked at Montana. I testified at the PUC last year about high costs in that state, and I expect a lot of this you see nationwide. But as Chris said, what you see in Montana from over a decade, you saw the cost of the program rise 40%. You saw a number of subsidized lines fall 30%. So we're seeing more spending and fewer beneficiaries. And I think the program is far too carrier-focused as it is. I would like to see it more customer-focused, consumer-focused. And I think there's lots that can be done to simplify the program. Another problem with the high-cost program is currently used is that you see largely the same companies every year doing this, even though a lot of people use cable companies. Cable companies don't typically participate. WISPs are a factor in rural areas. WISPs tend not to participate. And just finally, just one last point, it's just there seems to be a lot of administrative overhead for USF generally, and USF is 4 programs. The Highcost Fund, the rural program, is the largest, and last year, I think the administrative costs were $175 million, which, to put that in context, that's more than every state received in high-cost funds except for 5. So that's a lot of administrative costs because there are all these programs, there are all these calculations that go into distributing money, and I would like to see more consumer-focused and simplified program.
I don't know, do you still have a pending question?
Well, it's the continuing question. I guess I could state it more explicitly, which is we're going to talk a little bit about more outside the box thinking in the next round. But what kind of things
is the program going to blow up because of lack of funding, too much demand, not enough? The thing that Blair raised as the unseen, is that
was Blair's unseen thing that is not being dealt with. And so, but the question is, what would you do if right now you can only make minor changes to it within the current like let's say it's 6 months to make minor changes in it? What kind of things do you do?
I would jump in and then I apologize, but I do think one thing that's going to be really interesting to watch is the CAF 2, which was the auction proposal that the FCC just put into place where folks came in and basically bid and said, I can do this for X, and the lowest winner wins the bid. And to your point, yeah, there were WISPs that got money, Viasat got money. I think it's going to be I think this is really interesting to watch because, first of all, it's the first time the FCC has tried a model like this. But honestly, I'm kind of skeptical. So there is a part of me that says these resources are pretty precious. People made an obligation in terms of their technology. They're willing to deploy. The speeds are willing to achieve. Frankly, we have not seen some of these commercially available. So I think these are important things to take note of and to be watchful for to see how successful we can look to tinker with the program to get resources.
So let me answer Chris's question, and I'll touch on what Shirley said in this way, because the costs do continue. The E-rate program was bumped up several years ago. The Highcost program was bumped up. It is now in total, if you include the telecommunications relay service program, over $11 billion that the FCC administers. I'm not going to go through all the programs, but with Highcost, when I was at the FCC, I came to the conclusion that first it was necessary to get fiber to every rural home as a matter of the economic, social, cultural life of rural America. But second, I came to the conclusion, which I think was shared by nobody at the FCC, which is it is affordable to do so. And it is affordable to do so particularly if what you focus on is the capital expenditure, and once the capital expenditure is made, the operations largely do pay for themselves, so long as you have some kind of scale. Now, the federal government will spend, not just through the CAF program and the other high-cost programs, but the RUS programs, and if there's an infrastructure bill and everything else, it's going to spend somewhere between $50 and $100 billion over the next decade on rural broadband, which is a fantastical kind of notion. I mean, whoever, like, rural broadband, really, like, there's a whole room of people talking about rural broadband. It hasn't been that way in the past, except for people like Shirley talking about it, for far less money. My own estimate is it's somewhere between $10 and $20 billion of public funding. You can get fiber to every single rural home in America. Now, if you want to add some kind of waste and slop and some people getting money who shouldn't, maybe the number is between $20 and $30 billion. But it's not 50, and it's certainly not 60 or 70 or 80 billion or more than that. So there does need to be a change, otherwise we'll continue to do what we've been doing since 1996 in the passage of the Communications Act, which is continuing to spend lots and lots of money on small incremental improvements, and the government will continue to spend money on 4.1, on 10.1, on 25.3, on something else, spend the money once on the infrastructure that the country needs, and move on to the next problem. There's a lot of things I can't come up with a solution for, not health care or peace in the Middle East or anything else, but rural broadband, it's not that complicated. There's a solution to it.
Funny you should mention that. One of the things that we are part of at Public Knowledge, and Chris and his organization, Institute for Local Self-Reliance, are also part of it, is we have a coalition called the Broadband Connects America, where part of what the big thing, to my mind, of what we were trying to do is to get people to think in that outside-of-the-box way. And by the way, I'd like to hijack this from you and move out of USF to the more out-of-the-box stuff, because USF is there. And I agree very much with John that, and I'm not going to say it's all bad. I mean, as Shirley and her members have proven and you've proven, it does do a bunch of good. The tendency, and social media has conditioned all of us to believe this is the greatest, most important thing ever, or this is total dreck. And USF doesn't fall on either of those extremes, but it's a very limited type of approach based on a program that was developed in statute in 1996 that was based on programs that were developed in the 1980s as a consequence of our breaking up the monopoly Bell system, which used an entirely different method starting in the 1920s and 30s of how we funded connectivity. And as I like to say, put a phone on every farm, because yeah, we've solved this problem before. And I think that one of the things that Broadband Connect America does is have a set of principles around what we think funding ought to be like. And one of the number one lead principles, what I sum up as fund infrastructure, not carriers. Because once you have actually built out the network, then, especially if it's a fiber network, then the cost of maintenance goes down significantly, especially as compared to building the initial network as a whole. So I would like to see, as a bipartisan effort going forward, looking for ways in which we can, rethink these programs and not be all myopic on trying to fix, because the problem is this: people keep thinking, well, let's just try to fix USF, that'll be easier because it's here and it's there, and people generally all agree. And we've been trying this for 15 years, and we have not been able to fix USF in any substantial way. And we should give up on the idea that potchking around with this, potchking is a technical term meaning, but that messing around with this is going to somehow really produce a significant alteration in how we're funding broadband, and really shift the bulk of our energy to thinking of what are the out-of-the-box different sorts of approaches that are going to help us out. And then what's left over in USF high cost will be very useful for helping to maintain the operation of networks once they're there. But let's start thinking about something else.
Yeah, let's talk about outside the box, and then we're going to do questions.
Yeah, Shirley said to me before we joined you, she said, 3 Jews on a panel talking about rural broadband. Where are you going to find that?
Brent, did you want to
Bringing
talk about any of
broadband to the Catskills is important.
So, Brent, I know that you have at least one outside the box idea.
Yeah, I'll touch on a few, and we've kind of been leading up to it, but I think this should be consumer focused. I don't know what the term is. If you're left of center, plug your ears. A voucher, consumer voucher, but this is largely how Lifeline runs, right? It's you receive a monthly subsidy per household, and for Lifeline, I think it's $9.25 a month. You can imagine a similar thing for rural, and I think the time is right. This is not unique to me, but no one's explored this for several years. Over 90% of households have access to 25/3 services, landline. Over 95% have LTE access, 99% have satellite access. So the argument in the past was if you have a subsidy, if you have a household subsidy, the monopoly carrier will only just raise the rates to accommodate that. And today, I don't think you'll see that monopoly raising of rates in most of America. So this idea, whatever you want to call it, Lifeline for rural, voucher, I think that's something that should be explored, perhaps as an opt-in for states. And I'll say another thing about the Highcost Fund. I started looking at this, if you took funds that are going into states and divide it by the number of rural households in the state, and you get some interesting, I would say, concerning thing. I mean, it makes sense that Alaska costs, there's more per household than rural households in New Hampshire. But why does South Carolina get 3 times rural households in rural North Carolina? I don't know. Why does Mississippi rural households get 9 times as much as rural Alabama households? I don't know. And a household voucher would eliminate much of that inexplicable inequity. And you could tier it based on the cost of service. And just one final thing, something I've been writing about lately is on the wireless side, because I think wireless for a lot of people, particularly fixed wireless, will be a good option for them. And as the FCC, as CBRS develops and WISPs, you see some consolidation in the WISP market, which is, I think, a good thing. And WISPs largely don't participate in these programs. So one thing the FCC could do is if you're familiar with the OTAR rules, it's the pizza box idea that if you have a satellite dish smaller than a pizza box, you can put it on your private property, and within reason, a local government or HOA cannot charge you fees or regulate where you put this on your private property. You can imagine similar rules that protect wireless infrastructure. Currently, the FCC's interpretation is this does not protect wireless infrastructure like CBRS and WIFs and the other things. So I think that could be expanded under the current statute.
I want to, and I'm going to hand it over to you. So I want to say one thing about the voucher idea, and then another thing, and hand it off to Shirley. The folks I work with have participated in various ways that the federal government distributes funds. We participated in the CAF auction. We were the largest, my group was the largest winner in the auction at the gigabit tier, at the fiber to the home tier. I know that Shirley and I agree that the best solution for rural America is fiber to the home, not wireless, fixed wireless, or others. The reason, and Shirley does not support a voucher system, and let me say why I do, and it's not going to convince Shirley, but here's why I support a voucher system. Again, I can play by anybody's games on this so long as the game is open to all competitors, whether it's an application process or an auction or vouchers or anything else. You can play on all those fields. The reason I have a slightly favor a portable subsidy is because I can't convince Brent, I can't convince others. I couldn't convince Mignon while she was chairman and I was at the FCC. I couldn't convince Julius, I couldn't convince Tom. I couldn't ever convince anybody that fiber to the home should be what the government spends its money on. And I know I can be pretty persuasive, and I'm clever at coming up with arguments. It didn't matter. I can come up with every argument under the book. It didn't matter. Nobody ever believed it. But if you let, and this is what I know that some other people don't seem to know, if you leave it up to consumers to choose, they don't choose fixed wireless. They choose the best service available, which is fiber. In the last few years, the companies I work with, we've gained now close to 100,000 new customers in rural America. We started with nothing. That means every single time we get a customer, it's a new customer. I've never lost a customer to a fixed wireless service provider or a satellite provider. I know what consumers choose.
I think that's, I'm sorry to cut you off, it's just I do want to make sure we get at least a couple of questions in. So I want to give Shirley a chance to talk about this briefly, and then Harold, I'll ask you to very briefly finish up this section.
So 96, I remember, it came up for a vote. Vouchers came up on the floor. I think John McCain voted for it. I'm not sure how many other folks did. I speak from a carrier perspective. Vouchers don't build a network. If you're, I can look at, for example, the recent kind of turmoil in the Universal Service Program over the last couple of years, slow down in construction big time because there was a lot of regulatory uncertainty. People weren't sure how they were going to fund the network. If you are a carrier and you are making a decision that I'm now going to go out from my donut hole out to the donut where my more rural subscribers are, but you're not sure year to year what your support mechanism is going to be, I can guarantee you're not going to make the investments because, again, we're talking about those areas that are already so difficult to make a financial investment in. So I look at it from a perspective and I say, I think that regulatory uncertainty and that uncertainty annually is just enough to actually really throw cold water on it. Now, that's not to say I don't think it's going to take a whole toolbox. I think it's going to take a little bit of everything. I've got 16% of my member companies use unlicensed spectrum, 14% use licensed spectrum. You know what? When you've got that ranch at the end, you're using whatever you need in that toolkit to get out there and to build that network. Is it sustainable and long term? No, I'd like to think that eventually you're able to make that construction plan to bring that fiber out there. But I think in a lot of cases that connectivity right now is really important, and then you figure out how to build to it. And my concern, and again, I look at it from guys who I've been watching making investment decisions for 30 years, it will not build it.
Yeah, okay, a couple of things really quickly, and one of the advantages of I don't have a favorite technology. I have no dog in this fight. I think wireless is cool, but I think fiber is cool. And I agree that people buy the best service that is available to them that suits their needs. But let me just shoot out a couple of things real fast to think of in terms of bipartisan cooperation opportunities here. One is break down the supply chain to the consumer into its component pieces and figure out how to lower the cost or fund or whatever each one of these stages as a method of bringing down cost. You know, BTOP, which
Harold,
was
sorry, would you mind, I think that was a very good explanation. Maybe just move on to your next.
Okay. Next is we need to confront the fact that there are a lot of problems here because we're not going to be entitled to, or we're not entitled to right now. And the biggest one of these is making sure that everybody within an area has access. Because right now, let us set aside the poor quality of the maps at the moment and our arguments about unserved and underserved. The fact is, if I'm in an area, there is no state or federal law that requires a carrier to come out and serve me. In fact, we have had a number of instances where people have called up carriers and said, you guys run service out here? Oh, yes, we definitely do. It turns out we don't, and you can't even freaking sell your house anymore because nobody wants to buy it. So we have to deal with the universal service problem. If we're not going to be Title II, which obviously I think we should be, then we cannot claim to have solved the rural broadband problem until we have dealt with the universal service mandate. And the last thing I just want to bring in mind is in the area of energy. We have done this shattering of the supply chain so that we now talk about individuals generating their own. I can, in theory, generate my own energy and sell it back to the grid. Other people can do that. We need to be thinking about whether we ought to be focusing on, say, interconnection rather than on the question of just building out a network. Whether we ought to provide incentives for people to build, some sort of connectivity from their own home and plug it in somewhere else. And if you say that's silly, I will say there's now an entire business out there doing effectively that with solar, where you put individual solar cells on people's homes and then aggregate that and sell it back to the grid. Would some kind of business that just puts fiber connections from an interconnection point to households work equally well and then be open for other people to take over the actual management of the network? I don't know, but that might be an interesting set of policies to pursue rather than focusing on who do we want to hand a big bag of money to.
Questions? And we're not going to have time for a lot, so let's get some good ones, or at least one good one to start.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Schmitz. I do consulting, but I'm from a multi-partner network on a private end that actually paid for itself and is pretty lucrative. So we go and we do business plans. But I do have a question for the panel. Actually, two questions. One, do you think data is a commodity? And number two, whose information do you think it really is? Because the people are paying for it, and we don't seem to ever get the dividends the private companies do.
It's almost like you're segueing into our next panel.
Data or personal data? Data. Just data generally, depends on the type of data. I don't think my personal data ought to be a commodity, and I think I ought to have some kind of interest that continues to run with it, even when it is in the hands of somebody else. But if you're talking about, other types of data, like how many times my computer crashes so that Microsoft or Apple can repair it, then sure, that could conceivably be a commodity.
I largely agree with Harold on this.
You heard it here.
Some people are so surprised when that happens.
Do we have any additional questions? Of course, the other side of the room. Kat, former volleyball player, making her way across.
Thanks so much, panel, for this great conversation today. I just wanted to shift this a little bit. I know that 15% of all rural American populations are people of color, and I think we'd be remiss also if we did not include the tribal digital divide on tribal lands in the conversation of rural America. So if we could please just kind of speak to that, and maybe how does the rural digital divide affect people of color and people on tribal lands?
So I'll go ahead and take that because I've got a lot of tribal telephone cooperatives across the country that are, I've got about 80 companies that cross tribal land, and I've got about 10 or 12 cooperatives that are tribal cooperatives. So you're absolutely right. You see a really different demographic. You see some different regulatory treatment. For example, in the 96 Act, when universal service was created, we actually had to go in and get a technical correction that would allow for support on tribal lands because technically they didn't fall under federal jurisdiction. It was one of those things that people didn't understand. Thankfully, John McCain was chairman of the committee at the time, so we were able to get his support on doing that. But there is, there's special recognition. I think the FCC has been looking at that very hard in the last few months in terms of making sure that funding flows into those areas. But you've also got, you've got to really, the demographics are tough. If you look at things like the cutoffs, the number of folks who aren't able to pay their monthly phone bill and reconnects create some special challenges. So we absolutely agree. We have a tribal committee. It is comprised of both our tribal members as well as those who serve to try to figure out how do you have those constructive discussions and how do you do advocacy that is particularly focused on areas that really do have a whole different set of issues to be explored.
So I first of all want to thank you for pointing this out. A person whom I've never met before. But seriously, I want to thank you for making this point because, number one, in Washington, D.C., we tend to think of urban versus rural as code for white versus, and it is versus in the funding world, people of color, and that is just wrong. There are lots of poor white people who live in urban areas who need Lifeline. There are lots of poor white people who live in rural areas who need Lifeline, and there are lots of people in rural areas who are people of color who don't have access to broadband. So these are important things to keep in mind. I do want to say one of the things that I believe in terms of emphasizing community-based approaches and trying to think of this outside of the box also is, and not relying on sort of past historical approaches, is because it gives communities that have traditionally been marginalized another shot to get in on the ground floor of actually learning how to provide for themselves and creating those jobs internally in the community. Co-ops can be a very good way in terms of not just building off existing ones, but communities forming new co-ops for the express purpose of learning how to build and deploy networks, and then within that community having created new broadband jobs. I think also it's important for us to keep in mind that unfortunately, there was a lot of history of racial segregation, discrimination in how the initial resources were deployed, including in the wireline telephone network, and we need to be very conscious when we're building on programs like USF that are built on that skeleton and that DNA to make sure that we don't replicate those aspects or the legacy of those unfortunate discrimination in the past.
Yeah, we're short on time, so I'll be quick. I'll just mention for those who are interested in some of the tribal aspects, the FCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee had a group working on tribal broadband. It was led by Valerie Fasthorse, who's with the Idaho tribe, and it's fascinating learning, just about the issues getting broadband to these very difficult areas. So you can go on the FCC website, and the BDAC reports have some information.
I make one tribal land point. We do a lot of construction in Oklahoma. Oklahoma's got this unique characteristic in that nearly the entirety of the state is considered a tribal land for purposes of federal programs. What that means, and I see Mignon here, what that means is in the Lifeline program, you can get, for broadband or telephone service, but broadband service, you can get $34.25 for serving Lifeline customers. Now, when you're writing a business plan in a rural area, if you can get an extra $34 for serving a low-income household, and that just by virtue of being on a tribal land, it changes the business case. It is more like a voucher system than it is, in our experience, when you write business models to make an investment decision to build broadband or build anything else. Your investment decision is based on the revenue you're going to get from your subscribers. If you can add an extra $25, which is what you get in tribal land, it makes it an easier business case than in other places. So if carriers take advantage of the tribal lifeline enhancement, it makes it easier to build fiber networks or other kind of broadband networks in tribal areas. And if Mignon Clyburn had ever had her way, you would have had that same kind of enhancement across the program, which would have made broadband more affordable, which is really my main point in all of this, is people will buy broadband at the best speed they can get when it's affordable. And getting the affordability down to a level where it's affordable to all Americans is really one aspect, not just of rural broadband, but urban broadband and any other kind of service.
So I want to thank the panel for coming at this from a perspective of raising the different issues, and I think not trying to just win a debate, but actually raising up the different challenges and giving us all the ways to think around the problem. One thing I just want to throw in that we couldn't touch on is this idea of carrier of last resort, or does a household have an obligation? Do they have the right to having a broadband connection, or are we going to have plans that try to get it out there generally, and maybe some people don't get it, depending on the technologies we pick. We didn't have time to wrestle with that, but it's something that needs to be kept in mind as we craft these programs. But I would really like to thank our panel, so please join me in thanking them.